In this lesson, we're going to continue working on the refactoring of our navigation, and we'll try to change data structure which represents nav items from objects to array of objects, where every element will represent individual nav item, which will potentially let us simplify the code in a couple of places. So let's start with the nav component. And the first thing we're going to do in here is actually move this dynamic component, which is responsible for showing icons for nav items, into nav item component. So let's just cut this component from here, open nav item component, and here where we have used slot element, we're going to replace this slot element on dynamic component. In here we also reference icon variable, which is not available in this component yet. So let's think about the ways how we can get access to this variable. And to actually have a way to access this icon variable inside this nav item component, instead of passing one prop page name from outside, we can actually pass the whole object that will represent nav item, and this object will store two fields, page name as well as icon. So let's rename this prop on nav item, and wherever we are referencing page name, we're gonna reference this property by using nav item prop like so. And let's just do the same thing in our template. Firstly, inside of href attribute, then in here, when we are passing parameter to navigate function, here where we are showing the page name as a label of nav item, and finally, when we are referencing icon component. And to actually have a way to pass complete nav item object as a prop to nav item component, we need to change data structure stored inside of nav items constant, so that on every iteration of this loop, we can obtain a full nav item object, which later we can use to pass as nav item prop into nav item component. And since now all the information about nav item is stored inside of nav item object, we need to reference page property by using this object like this. And instead of passing only the page name in nav item component, we're gonna use nav item prop and pass the whole nav item object. And now we're going to work on data structure stored in this nav items constant declared inside of constant.js module. So instead of representing this data structure as an object, we're going to use array of objects. So let's declare nav items constant in here, and this time we're gonna use array, where every element will be an object with two properties. The first property page will store page name, and the second property icon will store icon component. So for the first object, the page will store the value of the timeline page, which we can grab by using page timeline constant. And as the icon component for the first nav item, we're gonna use clock icon. And now let's copy this object, paste a few more times, and replace values for page and icon properties. For the second object, the page name will be activities, and icon component is called list bullet icon. And finally, the third nav item component is going to contain the following values. Page name will be progress, and icon component is called chart bar icon. So we no longer need the previous representation of the nav items constant. Let's remove this commented code. And now on every iteration of this loop, we're gonna get individual nav item object with two properties, name and icon. And then every such object is passed further to nav item component. And in here, to validate value of this property, let's just use new function called isNavItemValid. This function doesn't yet exist, so firstly let's just write import of this function by replacing an import of unused function isPageValid. And since we have actually changed data structure which represents our navigation, we have to go to validators module and modify implementation of isPageValid function, because as we can see, this function uses nav items constant. And since now nav items is an array of objects, we're gonna apply validation a little bit differently. And the way to check if the page name passed as a first parameter to this function will be valid will be as follows. We can call method sum on this array, and in here we're passing the closure, where we are checking if the past page name equals to the page of some nowItem object from nowItems array. That means that our page is valid, and if at least one closure passed to the sum function will return true the value, the whole sum function is going to eventually return true. And now this is the way we'll be checking validity of the page. Previous implementation can be removed. So one more time, if the page name passed as a first parameter to this function matches any name stored inside of page property of some nowItem object inside nowItems array, that means that past page name will be considered valid. And now let's create one more validation function, which is going to validate the whole nowItem object. Let's call this function isNowItemValid, which will receive one nowItem we're about to validate. And the way we're going to do this is actually check if our nowItems array includes received nowItem object. So as we can see, the logic here is pretty simple. And please note that here we're actually checking references of objects and not actual values stored inside of properties of these objects. But for our needs it will be enough, because we are actually taking every object from this array and then passing this object as nowItem prop into nowItem component. And that validation function isNowItemValid is basically going to make sure that the past nowItem object is included inside of nowItems array. And of course, type of nowItem prop should be an object. And finally, by looking at the page, we can see that the refactoring was successful. Navigation is still properly shown. But the biggest difference now is that nowItems constant is no longer an object, but instead array of objects. And it is also important to check that we are not getting any validation warnings when we try to click around and navigate to different pages. As we can see, the console stays clean, which means everything is fine.